Okay, so now that you've gotten some background, now that we understand that we're studying expertise through this lens of practice, talent, access, and motivation, that's the word, and also looking at it in this esports context, let's go into my studies. So, given that esports is relatively new and relatively unique, I decided that I needed to look at a broad swath of players in order to describe the skill acquisition process in esports. That is, what factors predict success? So when you go into a tournament, is it your practice? Is it your reaction time? What sorts of things actually correlate with you performing well? And also looking a little closer at things like access and motivation. Participants I'm looking at, I looked at their performance in the tournament overall, but we'll get to that. I also asked some questions about their identity and personality. For example, are they super competitive? Is that one thing that would motivate or drive them? What kind of emotion regulation strategies do they use when they're faced with anxiety or difficulties in the game? How much do they identify as a gamer? How much do they identify as a smasher? And demographic information, of course. And for about 90 of these samples, I also got cognitive performance measures. So having them do reaction time tasks on the computer, written processing speed and creativity tasks, maybe those are some things that we would call talent that might contribute to expertise in gaming. As I said, the dependent variable for all this was, how do they actually do? What place do they come out in this tournament of 2,000 people? And for those who I had rank data for, I also looked at what does their rank predict. Okay, so this first graph I'm going to show you is a little complicated, so let's get oriented to it. On the x-axis here, we have the hours per week that they practice. On the y-axis, we have their tournament performance. That is, in what percentile did they end up placing? The different colored lines here represent how many years they've played. So if you look at this blue line, that's people that have only played 0 to 1 years, and their performance is lower if they don't practice very much and higher if they do. You'll notice that's a general trend across all of these years, is that the more you practice, the better you place. Who would have thought? But there's a lot of variance based on the number of years you've been playing. So both years and hours of practice matter. In fact, when you put this into multiple regression, practice explains about 23% of variance, which is about the largest chunk that I found. What's also interesting is when I asked them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 about the 16 game-specific skills, there is a two-factor structure. So there's skills that are very game-specific. Do you know the combos? Do you know about the game? Do you know the knowledge quiz? Do you know how to vary your strategy? And then there's emotion regulation. So the ability to keep cool under pressure comes out as a separate factor from things like, how well you play your character. What's interesting is that alone, each of these predict performance, but together, only the skill factor predicts performance, which makes sense. If somebody actually knows a whole lot about their character, it's not going to matter that much if you can regulate your emotions well against them, because you're going to get outplayed. What's also interesting about these self-ratings is that they represent some pretty accurate metacognition. So if you look at this graph, down at the bottom are people that perform worse, and at the top over here are people that perform better. And you'll notice that the variance gets smaller and smaller as they increase. You'll also notice that people are actually pretty good at saying how good or bad they are. So these top players that are placing in the 90th percentile and above, they are rating themselves as 9s and 10s on these skills. And part of that is because every tournament match, and even interactions within every match, every tournament as a whole, all of these things provide very specific feedback. As I mentioned in the beginning, that feedback is a great way for us psychologists to measure their actual expertise, but it also gives them a sense of how good they are. How often are they losing? To what kind of things are they losing? Is it always the same thing? Are there things they need to work on? So it shows that this game and esports in general provide a really solid feedback structure for participants, which is very motivating. However, when it comes down to looking at these skills beyond the two-factor, emotion regulation and skill model, it might not be that people are getting specific enough feedback to accurately say which of each skill matters. So people who rated themselves as 9s and 10s on the knowledge quiz where I actually asked them factual information about the game, weren't necessarily better at answering questions about factual information about the game. So although feedback will give you a general sense of your skill level, an average of across all of these skills, it may be that we need more specific feedback if people are going to be aware of where they're weak and improve. Okay, so although emotion regulation didn't turn out to be super predictive across people, I still think that there's something to be said for emotion regulation within people. So many of us have had an experience of choking. That is, we have practiced and prepared for something, but when the time comes to perform it, we markedly underperform to our potential. So because I'm interested in this choking, I worked with Sion Bielak in my undergrad, author of Choke. So I wanted to look a little more closely at emotion regulation, even though it wasn't predicting overall tournament performance. So this is the data that comes from the people that filled out a survey after every single match. I asked them things about their mood, how well they think they performed, that sort of thing. So what things affected people's mood across the tournament? If they won, so if you win, you feel good, and it gets you excited for the next game. How many games they played. So as the tournament drags on, people get more tired. That makes sense too. And their quality of play. What's interesting about this is sometimes a person could lose, but if they rated themselves as playing their best, they end up with a more positive mood. So people recognize that sometimes they're outclassed or outskilled, and they know within their own metric of their self-performance leads to a better understanding of how good they are or what they need to improve on. If you're pitted against a top 5 person in the world, very unlikely you're going to win. But if you went in there and you did the things you practiced and it worked out, feel pretty good about that. Related to this quality of play question is I also asked people whether or not they choked, that is markedly underperformed, didn't have a specific event in the game, or if they clutched it out. And a clutch means that you assembled all of your skills at once and performed at your peak, its peak performance. What we found was that both valence and arousal, so both the amount of energy you have and the positivity and negativity, but right immediately before a game, predicted whether or not you would choke or clutch after the game. So although emotion regulation may not make a difference between competitors, it does seem that within people, whether or not they play their own best, emotion regulation really makes a difference. So we've talked about practice. Now let's talk a little bit about talent. So like I said, for about 90 participants, I had measures of simple reaction time, choice reaction time, and processing speed. These things correlated at about 0.7 each, and so I combined them to make a single factor that I call a processing speed factor. Processing speed is really important to esports theoretically because it's how quickly, when you see something on the screen, are you able to take it in, classify it, and therefore form your response. So somebody with a faster processing speed will have more time to formulate a response or will just be quicker. So really important for esports especially. These cognitive skills of reaction time are known to be resistant to training, and they begin to decline at age 24. So these are something that are, these are skills that are sort of the closest thing I would say to talents that we could assign to an esports player. Sure, hand size affects your reaction time. Women have smaller hands, so theoretically we should be better esports players, right? But the idea being that these are skills that are potentially inborn and talent-based. So I hypothesized that higher ranks it would just be a linear relationship up, but it's not. However, processing speed factor does relate to tournament performance, and in fact, adds an additional 5% of variance over practice. So things like talent, processing, this is controlling for age as well, since we know age affects this. So there may be some aspect of talent. It seems that it is much smaller than the aspect of practice, but not something we can write off when we're discussing where esports expertise comes from. Okay, so both practice and talent are situated in the broader social context that determines motivation and access. So we're going to move on to this idea how social context might affect motivation and access. So like I said, women are severely underrepresented and we tend to underperform in tournament. So I only have 20 women in this group, but 250 men in this group, whatever. And women just are generally not doing as well. They're in a lower percentile than the men. And that could be supported by many anecdotes as well. But the question is, why? So it could be that women just aren't as competitive, but I'm finding that the women that are already in gaming scenes are equally competitive. It could be that they're not just having as much fun, so maybe they don't want to practice or get good, but that's not the case either. One interesting thing that's different between men and women is their identification with this community. So for example, women are much less likely to identify themselves as smashers. They're equally likely to identify themselves as gamers. So it seems that specifically being a competitive Smash player has an element to it of masculinity, and that can affect how women engage and process what's going on in this scene and their skill acquisition. We'll dig more into this in study 3. I also wanted to look at race and ethnicity because there could be differences in motivation because people are having different experiences within the gaming community. So I mentioned that there are bigger minority groups in the gaming community, and thus there are different stereotypes about minorities. There are different, people treat each other differently based on that. So where do we see any differences because of that different treatment? One thing that's interesting, oh, I forgot to flip the axis on this. In this case, lower is better. And you can, as you can see here, Asian and Black players consistently outperform relative to white players. It could be, you know, this could be a selection effect that only people who are good enough stick around because they don't want to deal with racism or whatever. This could also be a difference in motivation. So if you are in competitive gaming because you want to achieve, because you want to be better than other people and have peak performance, it could be that your racial identity is tied to that. Whereas white players might not have as much at stake in terms of fitting in socially, right? Another thing I looked at was emotion regulation. So if people are putting up with difficult or negative emotions in these gaming contexts, would we see some differences there? I find that Black and Hispanic players are less likely to use bad emotion regulation. I know I hate double negatives too, but there are certain emotion regulation strategies like rumination, self-blame that are correlated with depression. And what I'm finding is that Black and Hispanic players are less likely to use those than Asian or white players. So obviously this is correlational, can't really say the causality, but I do think that the differences that I'm seeing between these different groups could speak to the differences in how they're being treated and their own motivations for being in the scene. Okay. So looking back on this whole this whole study, just trying to get a sense of what is skill in esports. Practice makes up a big chunk of the variance in player tournament performance. Talent makes it up an additional 5%, which is much smaller. And of course, in this analysis alone, I've only accounted for 28% of variance, right? What if the other, 62% is talent, right? It's not conclusive, but given the noise in the data and such, I think it's really important to note how much more I can say about somebody's skill based on practice than their reaction time on a computer test. Players also have accurate metacognition about their skill. They get a lot of feedback in the terms of winning and losing, but maybe not feedback in terms of fine-grained skill. Emotion regulation does matter within individuals. It predicts how well you'll do for your own skill level. Even if it doesn't matter, your emotion regulation isn't going to make you beat somebody that's way outskilled of you. And then finally, there are social factors, social contexts that correlate with differences in performance that will be investigated further.